In the quiet woods of northern Michigan, sometimes the most broken hearts find exactly what they need to heal. When little Emily's world fell apart, she found comfort in the simplest things: her golden retriever Rusty and daily walks through her grandparents' forest. Every morning, Rusty led her down the same winding path, deeper into the woods. Her grandmother watched from the kitchen window, grateful that something still brought joy to Emily's eyes. These walks became their routine, until one day Emily came running back with something glinting in her small hand. Her grandfather cleaned the old coin carefully and realized it was real gold from 1943. What started as a child seeking comfort became an $8 million discovery that would change everything. But how did this treasure end up buried for decades under ancient oak trees? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The screen door squeaked its familiar greeting as Emily Thompson stepped onto the wraparound porch of her grandparents' farmhouse. The sound had welcomed 3 generations of children to this same threshold, and now it embraced a 6-year-old girl whose world had quietly crumbled back in suburban Detroit. Her small purple suitcase sat by the door, covered with butterfly stickers that seemed too cheerful for the circumstances that brought her here. Grandma Rose emerged from the kitchen, her flour-dusted apron telling the story of fresh-baked cookies waiting inside. Her silver hair caught the morning light streaming through the maple trees, and her eyes, the same deep blue as Emily's, held the kind of understanding that comes from decades of loving wounded hearts back to wholeness. "There's my sunshine." "Girl," Rose said, though they both knew Emily's light had dimmed considerably in recent months. The divorce papers might not be signed yet, but the careful conversations between her parents had grown into uncomfortable silences, then separate bedrooms, and finally this a summer away while they figured things out. Grandpa Frank rounded the corner from the barn, his weathered hand still strong at 72, his khaki work shirt bearing honest stains from morning chores. Rusty bounded alongside him, a golden retriever whose enthusiasm for life seemed immune to the weight of human troubles. The dog's tail created its own weather system as he spotted Emily, and for the first time in weeks, a genuine smile touched the corner of her mouth. "Well, look what the morning brought us," Frank said, his voice carrying the gentle authority of a man who'd spent 40 years teaching high school history before retirement called him back to the land his grandfather had farmed. "Rusty here's been asking about you every day since we got Rose's call." Emily knelt down as Rusty approached, his golden coat warm under her small hands. The dog seemed to understand that this little girl needed something different, not the exuberant jumping and face-licking he usually offered visitors, but a steady, comforting presence. He sat perfectly still and let her bury her face in his fur, absorbing whatever sadness she needed to release. The property stretched across 47 acres of northern Michigan's most beautiful woodland, a patchwork of meadows and dense forest. That had been Frank's family since the 1920s. Ancient oak trees stood sentinel over paths that meandered through clearings where wildflowers bloomed in defiant splashes of color. A small creek bubbled somewhere in the distance, its voice joining the morning chorus of birds that seemed determined to announce each new day as a gift worth celebrating. Rose led Emily inside to a bedroom that had been prepared with the careful attention of a grandmother who understood that familiar things matter most when everything else feels uncertain. Emily's favorite quilt, the one Rose had made for her 3rd birthday, covered a bed positioned perfectly to catch the morning light. On the knitstand sat a small purple journal, its pages blank and waiting for whatever stories this summer might hold. "I thought you might like to write about your adventures," Rose said, smoothing the quilt with practiced hands. "Sometimes putting thoughts on paper helps them make sense." Emily nodded solemnly, though she wasn't sure what adventures a summer in the woods might bring. Back home, adventure meant trips to the mall with her mother or the science museum with her father, when they still did things together as a family. Here, the loudest sounds were wind through leaves and Rusty's occasional bark at a squirrel brave enough to venture too close to the house. The first few days passed in gentle routine. Rose would wake Emily with the smell of pancakes and the sound of coffee percolating in the old-fashioned pot Frank refused to replace. After breakfast, while Rose tended her garden and Frank worked on the endless small repairs that farm life demanded, Emily would find herself drawn to the edge of the forest. Rusty seemed to understand her need for solitude. Each morning, without any prompting or calling, he would appear at her side as she stood at the tree line. His intelligent brown eyes would meet hers with a question that needed no words. "Ready for our walk?" The first path they took led to a clearing where butterflies danced among black-eyed Susans and wild lupins. Emily sat on a fallen log and watched their chaotic ballet while Rusty explored the perimeter, nose to the ground, following scent trails left by the night shift of woodland creatures. The silence felt different here. Not the heavy, uncomfortable quiet that had filled her house back home, but a peaceful emptiness that invited thoughts to settle and reorganize themselves. On the third day, Rusty led her down a different path, one that seemed fainter, as if fewer feet had worn it smooth. This trail wound deeper into the woods, past trees so old their trunks required several children holding hands to encircle them. Shafts of sunlight pierced the canopy in cathedral-like beams, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits. In the morning air, Emily pulled out her purple journal and began writing about the things she saw, the way moss covered the north side of every tree like nature's compass. How Rusty would freeze mid-step when he heard something she couldn't detect, the particular shade of green that seemed to exist only in this forest. Her handwriting, still careful and deliberate, filled page after page with observations that would have made her grandfather proud, though she didn't yet know of his passion for documenting the natural world. Rose watched these morning departures from the kitchen window, her heart both worried and hopeful. Emily had always been a quiet child, thoughtful in ways that sometimes seemed too mature for her age. The divorce had made her retreat even further into herself. But here in the woods with Rusty, something seemed to be awakening again. She's finding her footing, Rose told Frank one evening as they sat on the porch swing, watching fireflies begin their nightly performance. Frank nodded, remembering his own childhood summers on this same land. The woods have a way of putting things in perspective. Always have. He paused, watching Emily through her bedroom window as she wrote in her journal by lamplight. That dog's taken quite a shine to her. Indeed, Rusty had appointed himself Emily's guardian and guide. Each morning, he would wait patiently by her bedroom door until she emerged, then escort her to breakfast before positioning himself by the back door, his signal that adventure awaited. Their walks grew longer each day, following Rusty's increasingly confident navigation of paths that seemed to exist primarily in his memory. Emily began to notice patterns in Rusty's behavior. He would pause at certain trees, sniffing intently at their bases. Sometimes he would dig briefly at spots that looked no different from anywhere else, then look at her with an expression that seemed almost expectant. She wrote about these quirks in her journal, illustrating her observations with careful sketches of the dog's posture and facial expressions. By the end of the first week, Emily had filled nearly half her journal with detailed accounts of their daily expeditions. She described the family of deer that appeared each morning in the far meadow, the hawk that circled overhead with patient precision, and the particular quality of light that filtered through leaves to create patterns on the forest floor. But mostly, she wrote about Rusty, his unwavering loyalty, his mysterious knowledge of every trail and clearing, and the way he seemed to be searching for something specific. Rose found Emily one afternoon sitting at the kitchen table, carefully pressing a four-leaf clover between the pages of her journal. The discovery had sent Emily running back to the house with more animation than Rose had seen since her arrival. "Rusty found it," Emily explained, her voice carrying excitement for the first time all summer. "He just sat down right next to this patch of clover and wouldn't move until I looked down and saw it." Rose examined the small green treasure. "It's 4 leaves perfectly formed." "Well, I'd say that's pretty special. Your grandfather always says this land holds all kinds of secrets for those patient enough to look." That evening at dinner, Emily shared the story of the 4-leaf clover, her words tumbling out faster than usual as she described exactly where Rusty had stopped and how he'd seemed to know something special was hidden there. Frank listened with the careful attention he'd once given to students presenting their research, nodding at appropriate moments and asking questions that encouraged Emily to elaborate on details she might otherwise have overlooked. "Sounds like Rusty's quite the treasure hunter," Frank said, refilling Emily's glass of lemonade. "This property's seen a lot of history. Never know what might turn up if you keep your eyes open." Emily's eyes brightened at the suggestion of hidden treasures. That night, she added a new section to her journal: things Rusty might be looking for. The list included typical childhood possibilities, buried toys from previous visitors, old coins dropped by hunters, maybe even pirate treasure, though she acknowledged that pirates probably hadn't made it this far inland. As July settled into its rhythm, Emily's daily walks with Rusty became the anchor around which everything else revolved. Rose would pack them a small lunch sandwiches cut into triangles and cookies wrapped in wax paper, and Emily would slip the bundle into a canvas bag Frank had given her from his old camping gear. They would disappear into the woods for hours, returning only when the sun reached its highest point and the heat became too intense even for Rusty's enthusiasm. The walks were changing Emily in ways that went beyond the obvious. The color returning to her cheeks, the confidence growing in her step, the genuine laughter that occasionally rang out from the forest. She was learning to trust her own observations, to follow her instincts, and to believe that some mysteries were worth pursuing even when adults couldn't provide immediate answers. Most importantly, she was learning that healing didn't always require understanding why something was broken in the first place. Sometimes, it simply required the patience to let time and love and faithful companionship work their quiet magic lessons she was absorbing without realizing they applied to more than just daily walks in the woods. The journal grew thicker with each passing day, its purple cover fading slightly from sun and use, its pages filled with the careful documentation of a young girl's gradual return to wonder. Neither Emily nor her grandparents could have imagined that this simple record of summer adventures would soon become the key to unlocking a mystery that had been waiting nearly 80 years for the right combination of curiosity, patience, and the unerring instincts of one very special golden retriever. The morning air carried an unusual crispness for mid-July, and Emily felt it the moment she stepped outside. Rusty waited by the garden gate, his tail moving in slow, deliberate sweeps. Rather than his usual energetic wagging, something in his posture suggested today would be different. His ears were more alert, his gaze focused on a section of forest they'd explored only briefly before. "Where are we going today, boy?" Emily asked, adjusting the canvas bag on her shoulder. Rose had packed extra cookies, sensing that their walks were growing longer each day. Rusty padded toward the tree line with unusual purpose, choosing a path that wound deeper into the property than they ventured previously. This trail felt older somehow, less defined, as if the forest was slowly reclaiming it from whatever traffic had once kept it clear. Emily had to push through occasional low branches and step carefully over roots that created natural obstacles. Across their way, the deeper they went, the more focused Rusty became. His nose rarely left the ground now, and he would pause periodically to circle back and forth across the trail, as if following an invisible line only he could detect. Emily found herself walking more quietly, instinctively understanding that this wasn't a morning for chatter and games. After nearly an hour of hiking, Rusty stopped abruptly beside a massive oak tree whose trunk showed the scars of decades of storms. The dog sat down and looked directly at Emily, his expression so intent that she immediately approached to see what had captured his attention. At first, she saw nothing unusual, just the typical forest floor covered in last autumn's decomposing leaves and the early signs of this year's fern growth. But Rusty's focus drew her eyes to a small depression in the earth near the tree's base, an area where the soil seemed slightly different in color and texture from the surrounding ground. Emily knelt down and began carefully brushing away leaves and loose dirt with her hands. The earth here felt softer, as if it had been disturbed more recently than the packed soil around it. Rusty moved closer, watching her work with an intensity that made her feel she was participating in something important, though she couldn't yet understand what. Her fingers touched something hard and smooth buried just beneath the surface. Working carefully, she excavated around the object until she could lift it free from its earthen hiding place. Dirt clung to its surface, obscuring whatever lay beneath, but she could feel that it was metal cold and substantial in her small palm. "What did we find, Rusty?" she whispered, though the dog's fixed attention suggested he already knew exactly what treasure she held. Emily pulled a water bottle from her bag and slowly drizzled water over the object, using her thumb to gently work away the accumulated dirt and grime. As the layers of earth washed away, something began to gleam beneath a warm, golden color that caught the filtered sunlight streaming through the canopy above. Her heart began to beat faster as she realized what she was holding. It was a coin, but unlike any she'd seen before. One side showed the profile of a woman wearing what looked like a crown or elaborate headdress, surrounded by words she couldn't quite make out. The other side displayed an eagle with spread wings, its talons gripping arrows and an olive branch. At the bottom, clearly visible despite the coin's age, were the numbers 1943. Emily sat back on her heels, staring at the coin in amazement. She'd found old pennies and bottle caps during their previous walks, but this felt entirely different. The weight of it, the way it seemed to glow with its own inner light, the fact that Rusty had led her directly to this exact spot, everything suggested she was holding something far more significant than a simple lost coin. Rusty moved closer and nudged her arm gently with his nose, as if encouraging her to examine her discovery more carefully. Emily turned the coin over several times, noting details she hadn't initially observed. The woman's profile was beautifully detailed, her expression noble and serene. The eagle appeared to be crafted with similar artistry, its feathers individually defined despite the coin's small size. "We need to show Grandpa," Emily said finally, carefully wrapping the coin in the napkin from her lunch and tucking it safely into her bag. "He'll know what this is." The walk back to the house felt simultaneously longer and shorter than usual. Longer because Emily's excitement made every step feel urgent. Shorter because her mind was completely occupied with questions about her discovery. Where had the coin come from? How long had it been buried beneath that particular tree? And most mysteriously, how had Rusty known exactly where to find it? She burst through the back door with more energy than Rose had seen from her all summer. "Grandma! Grandpa! You have to see what Rusty found." Frank looked up from his newspaper, his reading glasses sliding down his nose as Emily's excitement filled the kitchen. Rose turned from the sink where she'd been washing lunch dishes, a smile already spreading across her face at the sight of Emily's animation. "Well, let's see this treasure," Frank said, folding his newspaper and giving Emily his full attention. Emily carefully unwrapped the coin and placed it on the kitchen table. Even in the indoor light, it seemed to possess an inner radiance that drew the eye immediately. Frank's casual expression shifted to one of focused interest as he leaned forward to examine the object more closely. "May I?" he asked, and Emily nodded eagerly. Frank picked up the coin with the careful reverence of someone who understood that they might be holding something genuinely valuable. He turned it over slowly, examining both sides with the methodical attention he'd once brought to historical artifacts in his classroom. His fingers traced the edges, testing the weight and feeling the quality of the metal. "Rose," he said quietly, "bring me that magnifying glass from the desk drawer." The gravity in his voice made both Emily and Rose move closer to the table. Rose returned with the magnifying glass, and Frank spent several minutes examining the coin under magnification, paying particular attention to the markings and the date. Finally, he set the coin down gently and removed his reading glasses, cleaning them slowly as he processed what he'd discovered. Emily watched his face intently, trying to read the emotions playing across his weathered features: surprise, confusion, and something that might have been concern. "Emily," he said carefully, "this appears to be a genuine gold coin. American. Eagle. Minted in 1943. He paused, choosing his words with the precision of an educator. "Coins like this are quite valuable, and finding one buried on our property raises some interesting questions." Emily's eyes widened. "Real gold? Like treasure?" "Very much like treasure," Frank confirmed. "The question is how it came to be buried beneath that oak tree, and whether there might be more where this came from." Rose sat down at the table, her expression thoughtful. "Your great-grandfather worked these woods during the war years. Always. Said he was just cutting timber for the effort, but he spent an awful lot of time out there for simple logging work." Frank nodded slowly. "I've wondered about some of the stories Dad used to tell. Always seemed like there were details he left out, things he thought too complicated for young ears." Emily looked between her grandparents, sensing undercurrents in their conversation that she didn't fully understand. "Can we look for more?" Rusty seemed to know exactly where this one was hidden. "I think," Frank said, standing up and walking to a cabinet in the corner of the kitchen, "that before we do any more searching, we should see what information we can find about your great-grandfather's activities during the war." He returned to the table carrying a shoebox Emily had never seen before, its corners reinforced with tape and its surface marked with her great-grandfather's name in Frank's careful handwriting. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper and organized with the methodical care of a historian, were letters, photographs, and documents that told the story of a man Emily had heard about but never truly known. "These are your great-grandfather Walter's war letters," Frank explained, carefully lifting out a bundle of envelopes tied with string. "He wrote to your great-grandmother every week he was away, and she saved everyone. I'd been meaning to go through them properly, but somehow never found the right time." Emily watched as Frank untied the string and spread several letters across the table. Even without reading them, she could see that they represented a piece of family history that might hold answers to the mystery of her golden discovery. "Tomorrow," Frank said, carefully rewrapping the coin in Emily's napkin, "we'll start reading these letters together. And if you and Rusty want to explore that area of the woods again, I think I'll join you." Emily nodded eagerly, her mind already racing with possibilities. As she helped Rose clear the lunch dishes, she kept glancing at the coin and the letters, wondering what secrets they might reveal, and whether this was just the beginning of something much larger than she could imagine. The next morning arrived with a sense of anticipation that transformed the entire household. Emily woke before her usual time, drawn by the promise of answers that might be hidden in her great-grandfather's letters. She found Frank already at the kitchen table, several envelopes spread before him, his reading glasses reflecting the early sunlight streaming through the windows. "I've been reading since dawn," he admitted, looking up as Emily approached. "Your great-grandfather was quite a storyteller. but he was also very careful about what he put in writing. Rose set a plate of scrambled eggs in front of Emily and poured fresh orange juice into her favorite glass, the one with painted daisies that had belonged to Frank's mother. "What did you find, dear?" Frank held up a letter dated September 1943, just 2 months after the date on Emily's coin. "Listen to this. Dearest Margaret, the work here grows more interesting each day. Yesterday, we discovered something in the north section that requires special handling. Can't say more in a letter, but I believe our efforts will serve a greater purpose than simple timber harvest. Give my love to young Frank and tell him his father is helping to protect something valuable for future generations." Emily paused with her fork halfway to her mouth. "He found something valuable?" "It certainly sounds that way," Frank replied, reaching for another letter. "And there are several references to special cargo and temporary storage throughout his correspondence from that period. After breakfast, the three of them prepared for their first official family treasure hunt. Frank had assembled a collection of tools that seemed both practical and exciting to Emily. Metal detectors borrowed from their neighbor Bob, small shovels, brushes for careful excavation, and a camera to document whatever they might discover. Rusty seemed to understand that today's expedition carried extra importance. He waited patiently as they organized their equipment, his tale maintaining a steady rhythm that suggested barely contained excitement. When Emily finally shouldered her purple backpack, now equipped with water bottles, snacks, and her precious journal, Rusty immediately headed toward the same trail they'd followed the previous day. "He knows where we're going," Emily observed, jogging slightly to keep pace with the dog's determined stride. "Animals have remarkable instincts," Frank replied, adjusting his grip on the metal detector. "Sometimes they sense things we miss entirely." The walk to the oak tree took on a different character with Frank's presence. He pointed out details Emily had previously overlooked, the particular angle of certain branches that suggested human intervention, the subtle changes in vegetation that might indicate disturbed soil, and the way the trail itself seemed to follow strategic vantage points, rather than simply taking the easiest path through the forest. "Your great-grandfather was a careful man," Frank explained as they paused to examine a series of blazes on tree trunks, marks that appeared deliberate rather than accidental. "These markings follow a pattern. They're creating a navigation system." When they reached the oak tree where Emily had made her discovery, Rusty immediately began his methodical sniffing routine, circling the area with the focus of a professional investigator. Frank assembled the metal detector while Rose unpacked the excavation tools, and Emily opened her journal to document their systematic search. The metal detector's first sweep of the area around the oak tree produced an immediate response, a steady beeping that grew more intense as Frank moved the device closer to the tree's base. Emily felt her heart race with the same excitement she'd experienced the day before, but magnified by the knowledge that they were now searching with purpose and proper tools. "There's definitely something here," Frank said, marking the spot with a small flag he'd brought for the purpose. Multiple readings in a rough circle around the tree. They began excavating carefully, Emily and Rose working with brushes and small tools while Frank continued scanning the surrounding area for additional readings. Within 30 minutes, they had uncovered 3 more coins, each identical to Emily's original discovery, each bearing the same 1943 date and the same warm golden gleam. 4 coins in the same location, Frank murmured, photographing their finds, before carefully wrapping each one. This wasn't someone accidentally dropping pocket change. Rusty had wandered approximately 20 feet from the oak tree and was now sitting in his characteristic alert position, staring at Emily with the same expectant expression he'd worn the previous day. Emily looked up from her excavation work and noticed his posture immediately. "I think Rusty's found another spot," she announced. Frank looked up from the metal detector, following Emily's gaze to where Rusty sat. The dog's position was unmistakable, the same focused attention, the same patient waiting for human comprehension to catch up with canine instinct. "Let's see what he's telling us," Frank said, carrying the metal detector to Rusty's location. The device immediately began beeping over a small depression near the base of another large tree. This one, a maple whose trunk showed similar marking patterns to the oak. Emily began carefully clearing away leaves and loose soil, following the techniques she'd learned during their morning's work. This excavation yielded different results. Not coins this time, but small metal objects that appeared to be military in origin. Emily uncovered what looked like buttons from a uniform, a tarnished metal insignia, and something that made Frank draw in his breath sharply. "That's a military compass," he said, examining the small round object Emily had freed from the earth. Standard issue for U.S. forces during World War II. Rose sat back on her heels, brushing dirt from her hands. Walter always carried a compass just like that one. Said it was the most important tool a man could own in unfamiliar territory. Emily added these discoveries to her journal, carefully, sketching each item and noting the exact location where it had been found. Her systematic documentation was beginning to reveal a pattern, a trail of deliberate hiding places that seemed to follow a logical sequence through the forest. "Look at this," she said, showing her grandparents the map she'd been drawing in her journal. "If I mark where we found each thing, they make a line going deeper into the woods." Frank studied Emily's careful drawings, noting the attention to detail and the emerging pattern she'd identified. "You're absolutely right. These aren't random hiding spots. They're markers leading somewhere specific." The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the trees when they decided to follow Emily's map trail to its logical next point. Rusty seemed to approve of this decision, bounding ahead with renewed energy toward a section of forest they'd never explored together. The terrain here was different, more challenging, with natural rock formations creating small caves and overhangs that would provide excellent protection from both weather and observation. Rusty's behavior grew increasingly focused as they approached a particularly large boulder that had apparently split apart sometime in the distant past, creating a narrow passage between two massive stone faces. Frank's metal detector began signaling. Before they even reached the boulder, its beeping growing more intense with each step. Emily felt the familiar excitement building in her chest, but now it was accompanied by something deeper, a sense that they were approaching answers to questions that have been waiting nearly 8 decades for the right combination of curiosity and circumstance. "I think," Frank said, switching off the metal detector and looking around at the natural fortification the rocks provided, "we're going to need more than afternoon to properly explore what's hidden here." Emily nodded, already planning their return expedition in her mind. Tomorrow they would come prepared for serious excavation, with better tools and more time. Tonight, she would study her journal and the patterns emerging from their discoveries, preparing herself for whatever secrets the forest was ready to reveal. Emily woke to the sound of unfamiliar voices drifting through her bedroom window. Glancing at the clock, she saw it was barely past 7 in the morning, earlier than her grandparents usually received visitors. She slipped out of bed and crept to the window, careful to stay hidden behind the curtain as she peered down at the front yard. A man in a khaki uniform stood near a white pickup truck, talking earnestly with Frank, even from her second-story vantage point. Emily could see the official badge on the man's shirt and the way her grandfather's posture had shifted into the cautious stance he adopted when dealing with unwelcome complications. "Just routine follow-up on some reports from neighbors," the man was saying as Emily cracked her window to hear better. "Folks have noticed increased activity in your woods lately. Metal detecting equipment, that sort of thing." Frank's response was measured, giving away nothing. "My granddaughter and I have been taking nature walks. She's interested in learning about the property." Of course. Nothing wrong with that." The man's tone carried the artificial friendliness of someone fishing for information. "It's just that this area has some historical significance, and we'd like to keep track of any archaeological activities that might be taking place." Emily felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Someone had been watching their treasure hunting expeditions, reporting their activities to official authorities. The innocent family adventure was beginning to feel like something more complicated and potentially problematic. She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, where Rose was standing by the kitchen window with a cup of coffee, her expression tense as she monitored the conversation outside. "Who is that man?" Emily whispered. "County Historical Preservation Officer," Rose replied quietly. "Apparently, some of our neighbors have been more observant than we realized." Through the window, Emily could see Frank maintaining his diplomatic composure while the official continued his questions. The man pulled out a small notebook and seemed to be taking notes, though Frank's answers appeared deliberately uninformative. After what felt like an eternity, the official finally returned to his truck and drove away. Frank stood in the driveway for several minutes, watching until the vehicle disappeared completely, before walking back to the house with the deliberate pace of someone working through a complex problem. "Well," he announced as he entered the kitchen, "it seems our treasure hunting has attracted some unwanted attention." Emily felt her stomach drop. "Are we in trouble? Do we have to stop looking?" Frank poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table, his expression thoughtful rather than worried. "We're not in trouble, sweetheart, but we do need to be more careful about how we conduct our searches." Rose joined them at the table, bringing Emily a glass of orange juice and a plate of toast. What exactly did he want to know? "Mostly fishing, for information about what we might have found and whether we'd reported any discoveries to the proper authorities." Frank paused, choosing his words carefully. "The thing is, until we understand exactly what we're dealing with, reporting our finds might create more complications than it solves." Emily thought about the gold coins hidden in Frank's desk drawer and the military artifacts they'd carefully documented in her journal. What kind of complications? "Well," Frank said, "if these items are genuinely valuable historical artifacts, there could be questions about ownership, proper preservation, legal requirements for archaeological excavation, the kind of bureaucratic maze that could tie up our research for months or even years." Rose nodded understanding. "Meanwhile, someone else might come along and claim the right to search our own property." "Exactly." Frank reached across the table and patted Emily's hand reassuringly. "So we're going to continue our research, but we're going to be smarter about it. Shorter expeditions, different times of day, and we'll vary our routes to avoid establishing obvious patterns." Emily felt relieved that they weren't abandoning their treasure hunt, but the knowledge that someone was watching their activities added an element of tension she didn't particularly enjoy. "How do you think the neighbors knew what we were doing?" Frank walked to the window and looked out toward the tree line, his gaze settling on a house barely visible through the woods to the east. "Bob Kellerman's place has a clear view of the main trail we've been using. He's got good intentions, but he's also got binoculars and too much time on his hands since his retirement." Emily pulled her journal from her backpack and flipped to the map she'd been creating of their discoveries. Looking at it with fresh eyes, she realized their excavation sites were indeed visible from the neighboring property, especially if someone was deliberately watching with optical equipment. "We need to find a different approach route," she said, studying the topography she'd carefully documented. "Maybe if we come in from the south side through the really thick woods, we could reach the boulder area without being seen from Mr. Kellerman's house." Frank examined Emily's map with growing appreciation for her methodical documentation. "That's excellent strategic thinking. And you know what? I think Rusty might be able to help us with that too." As if summoned by his name, Rusty appeared at Emily's side, his expression alert and ready for whatever adventure the day might bring. Emily looked down at him and realized that the dog had never led them along the most obvious paths. He had always chosen routes that meandered through dense cover, following natural concealment rather than convenience. "He's been keeping us hidden all along, hasn't he?" she said with sudden understanding. "Smart dog," Rose observed. "Smarter than we gave him credit for." They spent the rest of the morning planning their next expedition with the careful attention to detail that Frank had learned during his Army service decades earlier. Using Emily's journal maps and Frank's military experience, they identified approach routes that would keep them concealed from neighboring properties while still allowing access to their target areas. Emily found the strategic planning aspect almost as exciting as the treasure hunting itself. She created detailed sketches of concealment options, noting the height and density of vegetation that would provide the best cover for their activities. Frank contributed tactical knowledge about timing, weather conditions, and the importance of varying their patterns to avoid detection. "The key to any successful operation," Frank explained, "is adaptability. We can't become predictable, and we can't let outside pressure change our fundamental objectives." Rose packed them a more substantial lunch than usual, understanding that their new approach would require longer periods away from the house. She also added a first aid kit, an emergency whistle to Emily's backpack, precautions that seemed more necessary now that their innocent family adventure had acquired elements of genuine intrigue. "Are you ready for this to get more complicated?" Frank asked Emily as they prepared to test their new concealed approach route. Emily shouldered her backpack and looked down at Rusty, who was already positioned by the back door with the patient alertness of a professional guide. "I think we've been ready for complicated since the moment we found that first coin." Frank smiled, recognizing in his granddaughter the same determination that had carried him through challenges far more serious than nosy neighbors and bureaucratic officials. "Then let's see what other secrets this forest is willing to share with those patient enough to search properly." As they headed into the woods using their new concealed route, Emily felt the thrill of genuine adventure coursing through her veins. What had begun as simple walks with Rusty had evolved into something that felt important and mysterious, a real treasure hunt with real stakes and real secrets waiting to be uncovered. The southern approach proved more challenging than their usual trail, requiring them to navigate through dense underbrush and around natural obstacles that had previously been invisible from their standard route. But Emily discovered that she enjoyed the additional complexity, the need to think carefully about each step, and to trust Rusty's instincts about the safest path forward. Most importantly, the new route revealed aspects of the property she'd never seen before: hidden clearings, small streams that created natural boundaries, and rock formations that suggested the geological complexity of their land extended far beyond what was visible from the house. "This is going to be even better," Emily whispered to Rusty as they paused to get their bearings. "Now we really are treasure hunters." The concealed southern route led them through terrain that felt almost primeval in its wildness. Ancient trees formed a canopy so dense that the forest floor existed in perpetual twilight, broken only by occasional shafts of sunlight that illuminated patches of moss and fern with cathedral-like beauty. Emily found herself moving more quietly here, instinctively, understanding that this deeper section of the woods demanded a different kind of respect. Rusty's behavior had shifted as well. His usual enthusiastic exploration was replaced by focused, methodical navigation, as if he were following a map only he could read. Every few minutes, he would pause and look back at Emily and Frank, ensuring they were keeping pace with his deliberately measured progress through the increasingly challenging terrain. "He knows exactly where he's going," Emily observed, updating her journal with careful sketches of their new route. "It's like he's done this before." Frank nodded, watching the dogs' confident navigation with growing curiosity. Animals can inherit behavioral patterns from their parents. Rusty's mother was born on this property, and her mother before that. It's possible he's following instincts that go back generations. They emerged from the dense forest into a clearing Emily had never seen before, a natural amphitheater surrounded by towering oaks and maples. At its center stood the split boulder they'd discovered the previous day, but approaching it from this direction revealed details that hadn't been visible from their original vantage point. The boulder wasn't simply a natural rock formation that had cracked over time. It showed clear evidence of human modification. One face had been carefully smoothed, and what Emily had initially taken for natural weathering patterns were actually deliberate markings, carved into the stone surface. "Look at this," Frank said, running his fingers along the carved symbols. "These aren't random scratches. They're intentional markings, dates, initials, maybe even a crude map." Emily pulled out the magnifying glass they'd brought and examined the carvings more closely. Among the weathered symbols, she could make out WT 1943 and what appeared to be an arrow pointing toward the narrow passage between the boulder's two halves. "W to Walter Thompson, your great-grandfather," Rose said softly. "He was here, and he wanted someone to find this place." The metal detector immediately began signaling as they approached the passage between the rocks. But unlike their previous discoveries, this reading was different, stronger, more consistent, suggesting something substantially larger than coins or small artifacts buried beneath the surface. Emily squeezed through the narrow opening first, her smaller size allowing her to navigate the tight space more easily than the adults. The passage opened into a small chamber created by the way the boulder had split, forming a natural shelter that was invisible from any direction except through the entrance they'd just used. "There's something back here," Emily called, her voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "Something big." Frank managed to squeeze through the opening, followed by Rose, and they found themselves in a space roughly the size of a small room, with walls formed by the interior faces of the split boulder. The floor was covered with decades of accumulated leaves and debris, but even in the dim light, Emily could see that the natural surface had been deliberately modified, working together. They began carefully clearing away the organic matter that had accumulated over the years. Beneath the decomposed leaves, they discovered a floor made of fitted stones, laid out with the precision of professional masonry work. And embedded in that stone floor, Emily's careful sweeping revealed the outline of what appeared to be a cover or hatch, its edges sealed with some kind of weatherproofing material that had managed to maintain its integrity despite decades of exposure. "This isn't just a hiding place," Frank said, examining the stonework with professional appreciation. "This is engineered construction. Someone spent considerable time and effort creating a permanent storage facility." Emily found herself holding her breath as Frank worked to clear the edges of the hidden cover. The metalworking was clearly military. In origin, heavy-duty materials designed for long-term protection of valuable contents. Along one edge, barely visible beneath accumulated grime, were stamped markings that included military specification numbers and a date. September 1943, the same month as the letter, Rose said, making the connection immediately. Walter wrote about discovering something that required special handling. Frank produced a small crowbar from their equipment bag and began working carefully at the edges of the cover. The seal had maintained its integrity remarkably well, but age and weather had made the opening mechanism stiff and reluctant. Emily watched tensely as Frank applied steady pressure, working methodically around the perimeter until they heard the satisfying click of old mechanisms finally releasing their grip. The cover lifted to reveal a metal container that had been custom fitted into the stone chamber below. Even in the dim light filtering through the passage, Emily could see that the container was substantial, roughly the size of a large footlocker. with military-style latches and what appeared to be a waterproof seal around its edges. "We're going to need better light," Frank said, though his voice carried the excitement of someone who understood they were on the verge of a significant discovery. "And we should document this properly before we open anything." Emily pulled out her camera and began taking photographs from every angle, capturing the container's position, the surrounding stonework, and the military markings that were now clearly visible on its surface. Her journal received a detailed written description of their discovery, complete with measurements and sketches that would allow them to recreate the scene exactly if necessary. "What do you think is inside?" Emily asked, though part of her wanted to preserve the mystery for just a little longer. "Based on what we've found so far," Frank said, "I suspect this container holds answers to questions we haven't even thought to ask yet." Rusty had squeezed through the passage and was now sitting beside the open chamber. His attention focused not on the container itself, but on Emily's reaction to their discovery. The dog's expression seemed almost expectant, as if he were waiting for human comprehension to catch up with canine knowledge that this moment had been inevitable from the very beginning. "We should bring this back to the house," Rose suggested. "Whatever's inside deserves to be examined properly, with good light and stable conditions." Frank nodded agreement, though Emily could see his reluctance to leave without satisfying their curiosity about the container's contents. "You're right. And if there are more official visitors, we'll want to have everything safely secured before we deal with any additional complications." Working together, they managed to extract the container from its stone chamber. Despite its substantial size, it was lighter than Emily had expected, though still heavy enough to require careful handling. Frank fashioned a carrying sling from rope in his equipment bag, and they began the careful journey back to the house through their concealed route. The walk back felt both longer and shorter than usual longer, because the container's weight made progress slower. Shorter because Emily's anticipation made every step feel urgent. By the time they reached the house, the afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the kitchen windows, creating the perfect conditions for examining whatever secrets they had finally brought to light. Emily helped Frank carry the container into the living room, where they placed it carefully on the coffee table. The military markings were clearly visible now, including a serial number and what appeared to be a classification designation that meant nothing to Emily but caused Frank to raise his eyebrows in recognition. "Before we open this," Frank said, settling into his favorite chair, "I think we need to read more of Walter's letters. If he left us instructions or explanations, we should understand them before we see what he was protecting." Frank returned from the kitchen carrying the shoebox of Walter's letters and a pot of fresh coffee. The military container sat on the coffee table like a silent witness to secrets that had been waiting nearly 80 years for the right moment of discovery. Emily positioned herself cross-legged on the floor beside it, her journal open and ready to document whatever revelations the letters might contain. "I've been saving some of the more cryptic letters for when we had better context," Frank admitted, settling into his reading chair. "Now I think we're ready for them." He selected an envelope postmarked October 1943 and carefully unfolded the letter within. The paper was yellowed with age but still clearly legible, written in the precise handwriting Emily was beginning to recognize as her great-grandfather's distinctive style. "My dearest Margaret," Frank read aloud, "the special assignment I mentioned has taken an unexpected turn. What we initially believed to be temporary storage may become a much longer-term responsibility. Colonel Morrison has impressed upon our unit the critical importance of maintaining absolute secrecy about our activities here. The items we are protecting represent more than simple military supplies. They are evidence of actions that must never be forgotten, yet cannot be publicly acknowledged while the war continues." Emily looked up from her journal. "What kind of evidence?" Frank continued reading. I have taken the liberty of creating additional security measures beyond what the colonel ordered. Call it a father's instinct to protect something valuable for his son's future. The location I have chosen will serve our purposes well, but only if someone understands the significance of what we have preserved. I pray that if anything happens to me, Frank will someday have the wisdom to recognize the clues I am leaving behind. Rose set down her coffee cup with a gentle clink that seemed loud in the suddenly quiet room. He was protecting something for you, Frank, for our family. But what was he protecting? Emily asked, though her gaze kept returning to the military container that might hold those very answers. Frank selected another letter, this one from November. 1943. The war news grows more encouraging each day, but our work here has revealed the full scope of what we are fighting against. The items in our care were recovered from a Nazi transport that was attempting to reach South America through neutral channels. Gold, certainly, but also documents and artifacts that tell a story the world needs to understand. We have been ordered to secure these materials until proper authorities can determine their ultimate disposition. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. Nazi gold? Like in the movies? Not like in the movies, Frank said seriously. This is real history, sweetheart. During the war, the Nazis stole enormous amounts of treasure from the countries they occupied and the people they persecuted. Much of it was never recovered. Rose moved to the window and looked out toward the forest where they had spent the morning uncovering family secrets. So Walter was part of a military unit responsible for protecting stolen treasure until it could be returned to its rightful owners? Frank continued reading through the letters, finding references to special cargo, temporary custodial arrangements, and repeated emphasis on the importance of maintaining detailed records of everything they were protecting. But it was a letter from January 1944 that provided the most crucial information. Margaret, I must share something with you that weighs heavily on my conscience. The official chain of command for our operation has been compromised. Colonel Morrison was recalled to Washington under circumstances that suggest political rather than military motivations. The new commanding officer has different ideas about the ultimate disposition of our protected materials. I fear that what was meant to be temporary custodial care may become permanent appropriation by those who have no right to these items. Emily looked up sharply. What does that mean? It means, Frank said grimly, that Walter suspected someone was planning to steal the Nazi treasure for personal gain, rather than returning it to its rightful owners. The next letter provided even more disturbing details. I have made a decision that may be viewed as insubordination, but I believe it serves a higher justice. Rather than allow these materials to disappear into private hands, I have removed them from official custody and placed them in secure storage on our family property. When the war ends and proper international authorities can be established, the materials can be returned to legitimate custody. Until then, they remain safe and documented, waiting for a time when justice can be served without corruption. Rose sat down heavily in her chair. Walter stole the Nazi treasure to prevent it from being stolen by his own commanding officers. He protected it, Frank corrected gently. There's an important distinction. He left detailed records, maintained careful documentation, and preserved everything with the intention of eventual proper disposition. Emily studied the military container with new understanding. So whatever's in there doesn't really belong to us? Frank nodded approvingly at her ethical reasoning. That's exactly right, sweetheart. We're custodians, not owners. Our responsibility is to understand what Walter preserved and then determine the most ethical way to handle it. From the kitchen, they heard the unmistakable sound of a vehicle pulling into their driveway. Frank moved quickly to the window, and his expression immediately grew tense. It's that preservation officer again, he said quietly. And he's not alone this time. Emily felt her stomach clench with anxiety. Through the front windows, She could see 2 official vehicles and several people in uniforms gathering near the front porch. Rose immediately began clearing the coffee table, moving Walter's letters and the military container into the back bedroom while Frank prepared to answer the door. "Emily," Rose whispered urgently, "take Rusty and go upstairs. Stay in your room until we call for you." Emily grabbed her journal and followed Rusty up the stairs. But instead of going to her room, she positioned herself where she could hear the conversation downstairs. The voices were too muffled to make out specific words, but the tone was clearly more serious than the previous day's casual inquiry. After what felt like an eternity, she heard the vehicles driving away. Frank's footsteps on the stairs told her it was safe to emerge from her hiding place. What did they want? Emily asked, though the grim expression on Frank's face already suggested the answer wouldn't be reassuring. "Someone has filed a formal complaint alleging that we've discovered historically significant artifacts without reporting them to proper authorities," Frank explained. "They have a court order allowing them to conduct an official search of the property tomorrow morning." Emily felt her heart sink. Are they going to take everything away? "Not if we're smart about this," Frank said, his military training evident in the way he immediately began formulating a response strategy. "We have tonight to properly document everything we found and to make some important decisions about how we want to handle this situation." Rose emerged from the back bedroom carrying the military container. "I think it's time we opened this and found out exactly what Walter wanted us to protect. If we're going to face official scrutiny tomorrow, we need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with." Emily nodded agreement, though part of her wished they could preserve the mystery just a little longer. Tomorrow would bring complications and difficult decisions, but tonight still belonged to their family and the secrets Walter had trusted them to discover. Frank positioned the container on the coffee table and began working at the military-style latches that had protected its contents for nearly 8 decades. Emily held her breath as the final latch clicked open, knowing that whatever lay inside would change everything they thought they understood about their family history and their responsibilities as inheritors of someone else's moral courage. The military container opened with a soft hiss that suggested its waterproof seal had maintained perfect integrity for nearly 80 years. Emily leaned forward eagerly as Frank lifted the lid, revealing contents that were far more complex and significant than anything they had imagined. The top layer consisted of document folders wrapped in oiled cloth, each one labeled with Walter's meticulous handwriting. Below the documents, Emily could see the gleam of metal objects, not just coins this time, but bars of gold arranged in precise rows, like military supplies awaiting distribution. Frank lifted out the first document folder and carefully unwrapped it, revealing a collection of papers that included official military correspondence, detailed inventory lists, and what appeared to be a personal journal written in Walter's own hand. Emily watched her grandfather's expression change as he began reading, confusion giving way to amazement, and then to something that looked almost like fear. "Rose," Frank said quietly, "you need to see this." He handed her a single sheet of paper, an official military document bearing impressive seals and signatures. Rose read it silently, her eyes widening as she processed the information contained in the formal language. "What does it say?" Emily asked, though the gravity in her grandparents' expressions already suggested that this document contained information that would fundamentally change their understanding of the situation. Frank looked at Emily with the careful expression of someone trying to determine how much truth a young person could handle. "This is an official order dated September 15th, 1943, authorizing Walter's unit to take custody of materials recovered from a Nazi submarine that was captured attempting to reach Argentina." Emily felt her breath catch. "A real Nazi submarine?" "Very real," Rose confirmed, continuing to read through the documents. According to this, the submarine was carrying what they called cultural materials and monetary instruments that had been stolen from occupied territories throughout Europe. Frank began carefully examining the inventory lists, his expression growing more serious with each page. Emily, what Walter preserved here isn't just valuable, it's historically priceless. These lists document stolen artwork, religious artifacts, family heirlooms, and personal treasures that belong to thousands of people who were persecuted during the war. Emily looked down at the gold bars visible in the container and suddenly understood that she was looking at more than simple treasure. Each bar represented families who had been torn apart, communities that had been destroyed, and individual lives that had been forever changed by wartime cruelty. But why didn't Walter turn it over to the government after the war? Emily asked. Frank found the answer in Walter's personal journal, reading aloud from an entry dated March 1944. The corruption in our chain of command has become undeniable. Major Hendricks has made it clear that he intends to declare these materials lost in combat and arrange for their private disposition among his personal associates. I cannot allow items that represent so much human suffering to become sources of personal profit for those who should be protecting them. Rose continued reading from another document. Listen to this. It's a letter Walter never sent, addressed to military authorities in Washington. I am writing to inform you that I have removed approximately $8 million worth of recovered Nazi materials from compromised military custody and placed them in secure civilian storage. Complete documentation of all items has been preserved, and the materials will be held in trust until such time as legitimate international authorities can ensure their proper disposition to rightful owners or appropriate memorial institutions. Emily felt a mixture of pride and anxiety wash over her. So Walter was a hero, but also technically a thief? He was a man making an impossible moral choice, Frank replied thoughtfully. He could follow orders and allow stolen treasure to be stolen again by corrupt officials. Or he could break military law to protect it for eventual return to its rightful purpose. Frank began carefully removing items from the container, documenting each one with photographs before placing it on the coffee table. In addition to the gold bars, they discovered jewelry that clearly had personal significance: wedding rings, family heirlooms, religious items, each piece wrapped individually and accompanied by detailed notes about where it had been recovered. But it was the final folder of documents that contained the most shocking revelation of all. Frank opened it to reveal what appeared to be official Nazi documentation, including transport manifests and custody records that had been captured along with the physical materials. These documents, Frank said slowly, don't just prove that the materials were stolen from Nazi custody. They provide detailed information about where the items originally came from, who they belonged to, and in some cases, what happened to the families who owned them. Emily studied one of the Nazi documents, unable to read the German text, but recognizing the systematic precision of its organization. So we could actually find the families these things belong to? Some of them, possibly, Rose said, reading through Walter's notes about the documentation. Walter spent considerable time cross-referencing the Nazi records with information from refugee organizations and survivor networks. He was preparing to make systematic returns once he could identify legitimate claimants. Frank found Walter's master plan in the final pages of his personal journal. When this war ends and the world begins to heal, these materials must be returned to serve their proper purpose, either to surviving family members who can reclaim their heritage, or to memorial institutions that can preserve them as testimony to what was lost and what was saved. I have created a complete system for tracking provenance and verifying claims. My son Frank will have the intelligence and moral character to complete this work when the time is right. Emily felt the weight of this legacy settling on her shoulders like a heavy blanket. He wanted you to finish what he started, apparently. So, Frank replied, though his voice carried uncertainty about the enormity of the task. The question is whether we can figure out how to do this properly. especially with official authorities breathing down our necks. Rose had been studying the inventory lists with increasing focus. Frank, look at some of these entries. Walter didn't just preserve random stolen treasure. He specifically saved items that had clear documentation of their original owners. Wedding rings with engraved names and dates, family photographs, religious items with congregation markings. Things that could realistically be returned to surviving relatives. Emily examined one of the wedding rings, noting the delicate engraving inside the band. Heinrich and Rebecca, 1938. Such a simple inscription, but it represented real people whose lives had been destroyed and whose most precious possessions had been stolen from them. There are names and addresses in here, Frank said, reading through Walter's research notes. Refugee agencies, survivor organizations, international relief committees. Walter had already begun the process of trying to locate rightful owners. A sudden sound from outside made them all freeze, the unmistakable crunch of gravel under vehicle tires. Frank moved quickly to the window, and his expression immediately shifted to urgent concern. That preservation officer is back, he said grimly. And this time, he's brought what looks like a full investigative team. Emily felt panic rising in her chest. Are they going to arrest us? Not if we handle this correctly, Frank said, his military training taking over as he began rapidly formulating a response strategy. Rose, help me get everything back in the container. Emily, grab your journal and anything else that documents our discoveries. They worked with efficient urgency to secure the evidence of their family's secret history. But as Emily carefully wrapped the wedding ring back in its protective cloth, she realized that whatever happened next, they could never go back to simply being a family who'd found some interesting old coins in the woods. They were now the inheritors of a moral responsibility that had been waiting 8 decades for completion. Walter had trusted them to finish what he couldn't, to ensure that stolen treasures found their way back to the people and communities they had been stolen from, or at least to memorial institutions that could preserve their stories for future generations. The sound of official voices on the front porch told Emily that their time for private family decisions was over. Tomorrow would bring investigations, legal complications, and difficult questions about what they had found and what they intended to do with it. But tonight, in the quiet moments before they opened the door to official scrutiny, Emily understood that she was part of something much larger than a simple treasure hunt. She was helping to complete an act of moral courage that had begun during the darkest period of human history and was finally reaching its conclusion in her grandparents' living room. The knock on the front door came with the authoritative firmness of people who expected immediate compliance. Frank handed the military container to Rose, who quickly carried it back to the bedroom, while Emily gathered up the scattered letters and documents. The evidence of their discoveries disappeared from view just as Frank reached the front door. Mr. Thompson, the preservation officer said formally, I'm Agent Morrison from the State Historical Preservation Office. We have a court-authorized warrant to search your property for unreported archaeological discoveries. Emily felt her stomach drop at the name Morrison, the same surname as the Colonel Walter had mentioned in his letters. The commanding officer, who had been mysteriously recalled to Washington. She caught Frank's slight pause as he registered the connection, though his expression remained carefully neutral. Of course, Frank replied diplomatically. We're happy to cooperate with any official investigation. Agent Morrison entered with 3 other officials, including what appeared to be a professional archaeologist carrying sophisticated detection equipment. Emily positioned herself where she could observe without interfering, noting how systematically they began examining the house and asking detailed questions about recent activities on the property. Our information suggests you've been conducting unauthorized excavations using metal detection equipment. Agent Morrison continued, consulting a small notebook. We need to examine any materials you may have recovered and document the locations where discoveries were made. Frank maintained his composed demeanor, while providing carefully truthful answers that revealed nothing about the full scope of their findings. Yes, they had been taking nature walks in the woods. Yes, Emily had found some old coins during their explorations. No, they hadn't realized that such discoveries required official reporting. Emily watched the search with growing anxiety, particularly when the team began examining her journal and the simple treasure map she had created during their early expeditions. The archaeologist studied her careful documentation with professional interest, making notes about the systematic nature of her record-keeping. "This is quite detailed work for a child," the archaeologist observed. "These location markers suggest a methodical search pattern rather than casual discovery." "Emily's very thorough," Frank replied. "She likes to document everything she sees during our walks." The search continued for nearly 2 hours, with the team examining every room of the house and conducting preliminary surveys of the immediate yard area. They found nothing incriminating, but Emily could see that Agent Morrison remained suspicious about the level of their recent activity in the woods. "We'll be conducting a comprehensive survey of your forest areas tomorrow," Morrison announced, as the team prepared to leave. "I trust you'll make yourselves available to guide us to the specific locations where discoveries were made." After the officials departed, the family gathered in the kitchen to process what had just occurred and plan their response to tomorrow's official search. The military containers sat on the kitchen table like evidence of secrets that were becoming increasingly difficult to protect. "We need to make some serious decisions tonight," Frank said, pouring coffee for himself and rose while Emily nursed a glass of milk. "Tomorrow they're going to find that boulder chamber, and when they do, they'll realize we've been much more successful than we've admitted." Rose studied Walter's journal, which they had managed to keep hidden during the search. "The question is whether we tell them the full truth about what Walter was protecting, or whether we try to maintain some level of family control over the situation." Emily had been thinking about this dilemma throughout the evening. What would happen if we told them everything? About Walter saving the treasure from corrupt officers, and about his plan to return everything to the rightful owners? Frank considered the implications carefully. On one hand, it would demonstrate that we understand the historical significance of what we found and that we have legitimate intentions for handling it properly. On the other hand, it would also reveal that our family has been in possession of stolen Nazi materials for 8 decades without reporting them. But they weren't stolen, Emily protested. Walter was protecting them from people who wanted to steal them. "Try explaining that distinction to federal investigators," Rose said gently. "Government bureaucracy isn't always interested in moral complexity." Emily opened her journal to the detailed notes she had made about Walter's documentation system. What if we could prove that Walter's way was actually better? That he found more families and returned more items than the government would have? Frank looked at her with growing interest. "What do you mean?" "Look at all the research Walter did," Emily said, spreading out the documents they had discovered. He had names, addresses, refugee organization contacts. He was actually working to find the real owners. What if the government people in 1943 would have just put everything in a warehouse somewhere and forgotten about it? Rose began examining Walter's correspondence with survivor organizations, her expression growing thoughtful. "She has a point, Frank. These letters show that Walter was in active contact with international refugee agencies, Jewish community organizations, and survivor networks. He wasn't just hiding the treasure. He was actively working to prepare for its proper return." Frank studied the documentation with renewed appreciation for his father's systematic approach. And some of these letters are from the late 1940s, which means Walter continued his repatriation efforts well after the war ended. Emily felt excitement building as she realized the significance of what they were discovering. So Walter actually did return some of the treasure? He didn't just save it, he was already giving it back to people? That's exactly what these records Show, Frank confirmed, reading through a folder labeled Successful Returns. Wedding rings returned to surviving spouses. Family photographs sent to refugee agencies for identification. Religious artifacts returned to reconstructed synagogues. Walter was running his own private repatriation program. Rose found Walter's final letter, dated 1951. I have successfully returned approximately 40% of the individual items to verified family members or appropriate memorial institutions. The remaining materials require more complex research, as they involve families whose whereabouts remain unknown or whose entire bloodlines may not have survived. I am creating a complete archive of all documentation and research, hoping that future generations will have better resources for completing this work. Emily looked at her grandparents with sudden understanding. That's why Rusty knew where to find everything. Walter wanted us to discover it when we were old enough to finish what he started. Frank nodded slowly. And tomorrow, when those investigators find the chamber and realize the scope of what we've discovered, we need to be prepared to demonstrate that we're the right people to complete Walter's mission. They spent the rest of the evening organizing Walter's documentation into a comprehensive presentation that would demonstrate the systematic, ethical nature of his preservation efforts and their own commitment to continuing his repatriation work. Emily helped create a timeline showing Walter's successful returns and identifying the materials that still needed to be processed. The key, Frank explained as they worked, is to show that we're not treasure hunters trying to keep stolen goods, but rather custodians of a legitimate repatriation program that was temporarily interrupted by Walter's death. Rose had been studying the legal implications of their situation. If we can demonstrate good faith and legitimate intent, there's precedent for allowing private parties to continue established repatriation programs under official oversight. Emily felt a mixture of nervousness and determination as she contemplated tomorrow's confrontation with Agent Morrison and his team. Everything would depend on their ability to convince skeptical officials that an 8-year-old girl, her grandparents, and a golden retriever were the appropriate custodians of $8 million worth of Nazi treasure. But as she reviewed her journal entries documenting their careful, systematic discoveries, Emily realized that they had been preparing for this moment without knowing it. Every photograph, every sketch, every detailed description of their excavation process would serve as evidence of their responsible approach to archaeological preservation. There's one more thing we need to consider, Frank said, as they prepared to conclude their planning session. Agent Morrison, that's not a common name. And the timing of his appearance, right after we started making significant discoveries, ... double quotes Rose caught the implication immediately. You think he's related to the Colonel Walter wrote about? The one who was recalled under suspicious circumstances. It's possible, Frank replied grimly. And if he is, then his interest in our discoveries may not be entirely professional. Emily felt a chill of realization. So tomorrow might not just be about following proper archaeological procedures. It might be about protecting Walter's treasure from the same kind of corruption he was fighting against 80 years ago. Frank nodded seriously, which means we need to be very careful about how much we reveal and to whom. Walter trusted our family to complete his mission, but he also warned about people who would try to exploit these materials for personal gain. As Emily prepared for bed, she realized that tomorrow would determine whether Walter's 8th decade protection of stolen Nazi treasure would finally result in justice for the families it had been stolen from, or whether it would simply become another case of valuable historical artifacts disappearing into the bureaucratic maze of government agencies and private collectors. Either way, she was determined to honor the trust Walter had placed in their family and to ensure that his moral courage would not be forgotten or wasted. Rusty seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, positioning himself by Emily's bedroom door like a sentinel protecting secrets that had taken a lifetime to reveal and might take another lifetime to properly resolve. Emily woke before dawn to the sound of vehicles arriving in their driveway. Through her bedroom window, she could see Agent Morrison's team assembling with professional efficiency, their equipment suggesting a much more comprehensive investigation than the previous day's preliminary search. Frank and Rose were already dressed and waiting in the kitchen when she came downstairs, their expressions calm but alert. "Remember," Frank said quietly as they prepared to meet the investigators, "we tell the truth, but we tell it strategically. We want them to understand that we're allies in preserving historical materials, not obstacles to proper investigation." Emily nodded, clutching her journal and camera. Today, she would need all her documentation skills to ensure that whatever happened next was properly recorded for history. Agent Morrison knocked with the same authoritative firmness as the night before. But this time, his team included additional specialists, a historian from the State University, a representative from the FBI's art crime team, and what appeared to be a federal prosecutor. The expanded scope of the investigation made Emily's stomach clench with anxiety. "Mr. Thompson," Morrison announced formally, "we're here to conduct a comprehensive archaeological survey of your property. We'll need you to guide us to the specific locations where discoveries have been made." Frank led the group toward the forest with the measured pace of someone who understood that this walk would determine their family's future relationship with Walter's legacy. Emily followed closely, noting how Rusty seemed to sense the gravity of the situation and stayed protectively near her side rather than ranging ahead as he usually did. The procession through the woods felt surreal. 8 adults and 1 child, following paths that had become as familiar as the hallways of their house, but now with the weight of official scrutiny, transforming every step into potential evidence. Emily found herself seeing the forest through the investigators' eyes, wondering what conclusions they would draw from the subtle signs of their recent excavation activities. When they reached the oak tree where Emily had found her first gold coin, Agent Morrison's metal detector specialist immediately began systematic sweeping of the area. The device's steady beeping confirmed what Emily already knew, that this location had yielded multiple discoveries and had been thoroughly searched by amateur archaeologists with more enthusiasm than formal training. Significant metallic readings throughout this area, the specialist reported. Evidence of recent excavation work, multiple dig sites, systematic search patterns. The FBI art crime representative knelt to examine the soil, her trained eye noting details that Emily had never considered significant. "Professional quality documentation," she observed, studying Emily's photographs of their discoveries. "Careful excavation techniques, systematic recording, someone with archaeological training guided this work." Emily felt a surge of pride at the recognition of their methodical approach, even as she worried about the implications of such detailed investigation of their activities. Agent Morrison consulted his notes while examining the oak tree's surroundings. "According to our information, multiple gold coins were recovered from this location. We'll need to see all materials that have been found on the property." Frank exchanged a meaningful glance with Emily before responding. "We've been careful to preserve everything we've discovered. But before we show you the full scope of our findings, I think you should understand the historical context of what we've uncovered." Emily watched the investigators' faces as Frank began explaining Walter's role in protecting recovered Nazi materials from corrupt military officials. The federal prosecutor listened with particular intensity, taking notes about the legal implications of their family's 8-decade custodianship of stolen wartime treasure. "You're alleging that your father committed theft of government property?" Morrison asked with sharp interest. "I'm alleging that my father prevented theft of Holocaust victims' property," Frank corrected firmly. "And we have extensive documentation to support that distinction." The group's dynamic shifted noticeably, as the investigators realized they weren't dealing with simple treasure hunters who had stumbled upon valuable artifacts. This was a complex case involving wartime ethics, family legacy, and the ongoing challenge of Holocaust restitution. Emily felt the moment building toward revelation as Frank led them deeper into the forest, toward the split boulder that contained the most significant evidence of Walter's preservation efforts. Each step brought them closer to the confrontation that would determine whether their family's completion of Walter's mission would be supported or suppressed by official authorities. Rusty moved ahead of the group as they approached the boulder chamber, his behavior clearly indicating familiarity with their destination. The investigators noted this obvious sign that the dog had been trained to navigate to specific locations, further evidence of the systematic nature of their treasure hunting activities. What exactly are we approaching? The historian asked, noting the change in terrain and the increasingly deliberate nature of their route. Frank paused at the entrance to the natural chamber, his hand resting on the carved initials Walter had left as a marker for future generations. We're approaching the place where my father preserved $8 million worth of stolen Nazi treasure, along with complete documentation for returning it to Holocaust survivors and their families. Emily held her breath as she watched 8 pairs of professional eyes process this statement. Everything Walter had worked to protect, everything their family had discovered, and everything they hoped to accomplish in the name of justice. It all depended on what happened in the next few minutes. The silence that followed Frank's revelation stretched across the forest, clearing like a held breath. Emily watched the investigators' faces as they processed the magnitude of what they were being told. $8 million in Nazi treasure, preserved for 80 years by a family acting as unofficial custodians for Holocaust restitution. Agent Marson was the first to speak, his voice carefully controlled. Mr. Thompson, you're making some very serious allegations about wartime activities and current possession of what would be considered stolen property under federal law. I'm making serious allegations about wartime heroism and current stewardship of property that belongs to Holocaust survivors. Frank corrected, his tone carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades teaching history. And I have documentation to prove every word. The FBI art crime representative stepped forward, her professional training evident in the systematic way she began examining the split boulder and its carved markings. These inscriptions appear to be authentic wartime vintage. The weathering patterns and tool marks are consistent with 1940s metalworking techniques. Emily felt her heart racing as the investigators began squeezing through the narrow passage into Walter's hidden chamber. She followed closely, determined to witness whatever confrontation was about to unfold over her great-grandfather's carefully preserved legacy. The stone chamber had an almost cathedral-like quality in the presence of so many people, its walls seeming to echo with the weight of historical significance. When the federal prosecutor's flashlight illuminated the stonework Walter had created to protect his hidden storage area, Emily heard several sharp intakes of breath from the professional investigators. This is sophisticated construction, the historian said, examining the fitted stones and weatherproofing materials. Whoever built this understood both engineering and preservation principles. Frank produced a military container from its stone housing, setting it carefully on the chamber floor for the investigators to examine. The official markings and serial numbers immediately drew the attention of every person present, their flashlight beams creating a circle of illumination around Walter's carefully preserved legacy. Before you open that, Frank said firmly, I want you to understand that everything inside has been systematically documented and partially repatriated, according to my father's detailed research into rightful ownership. Agent Morrison knelt beside the container, his expression revealing nothing about his thoughts as he examined the military specifications and classification markings. Emily noticed that his hands trembled slightly as he worked at the latches, though whether from excitement, nervousness, or something else entirely, she couldn't determine. The container opened to reveal its carefully organized contents, each item wrapped and labeled according to Walter's meticulous system. The investigators stared in stunned silence at the gold bars, jewelry, and documentation that represented the life savings and family treasures of thousands of Holocaust victims. "My God," the historian whispered, carefully lifting one of the inventory lists. "This is a complete provenance record. Names, dates, locations of recovery. This is the kind of documentation that makes successful restitution possible." Emily watched the FBI representative examine Walter's correspondence with survivor organizations, her professional skepticism gradually giving way to recognition that they were looking at legitimate restitution efforts rather than simple treasure hoarding. "These letters are from established refugee agencies," she confirmed, reading through Walter's careful records. "The International Refugee Organization, the Jewish Agency for Palestine, several synagogue reconstruction committees." He was actively working with legitimate repatriation networks. Frank pulled out the folder containing Walter's successful returns, spreading photographs and documentation across the chamber floor. "My father didn't just preserve these materials. He spent 8 years actively returning items to verified survivors and their families." The federal prosecutor studied the repatriation records with growing amazement. "This shows systematic, ethical handling of recovered Holocaust materials. Better documentation than most official government programs from that period." Emily felt pride swelling in her chest as she watched these professional investigators recognize the moral courage and systematic integrity of Walter's preservation efforts. Her great-grandfather hadn't been a thief or a hoarder. He had been a protector acting when official channels had been compromised by corruption. Agent Morrison had been unusually quiet throughout the examination. His attention focused intently on the military documentation that revealed the original corruption Walter had been fighting against. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that surprised everyone present. "The Colonel Morrison mentioned in these letters," he said slowly, "was my grandfather. And everything your father documented about the corruption in that operation, it's all true." Emily felt the chamber's atmosphere shift dramatically as this personal revelation transformed the entire dynamic of their confrontation. Agent Morrison wasn't just a government investigator. He was the descendant of the very corruption Walter had been protecting the treasure from. "My family has spent 70 years wondering what happened to those materials," Morrison continued, his official composure beginning to crack. "My grandfather was court-martialed for theft of government property in 1945, but he always claimed the missing materials had been stolen by subordinates acting without authorization." Frank studied Morrison's face, noting the family resemblance to the old photographs they had seen in Walter's documentation. "Your grandfather was planning to steal Holocaust treasure for personal profit. My father prevented that theft and preserved the materials for proper restitution." Emily watched this confrontation between the descendants of two men who had fought over the same moral question 8 decades earlier. The outcome of their current discussion would determine whether Walter's protection of Holocaust materials would finally result in justice, or whether bureaucratic complications would prevent completion of his restitution mission. Morrison looked around the chamber at the evidence of Walter's careful preservation work, then back at the documentation, proving his grandfather's intended corruption. "Mr. Thompson," he said finally, "I think it's time we completed the work your father started." 6 months later, Emily sat in the same kitchen where she had first examined Walter's gold coin. But everything about her world had changed in ways she could never have imagined that first morning of discovery. The purple journal that had started as a simple record of summer walks now rested in the Smithsonian Institution's Holocaust collection, recognized as one of the most important documentation efforts in the history of wartime restitution. The formal ceremony had taken place the previous week in Washington, where Emily and her grandparents had been honored by representatives from 12 different countries whose citizens had benefited from Walter's preservation efforts. Standing at a podium in the National Museum of American History, Emily had read from her journal about the morning Rusty first led her to the oak tree, her words carrying across an audience that included Holocaust survivors, their children, and grandchildren who had received family treasures they never expected to see again. Agent Morrison, who had revealed himself to be David Morrison, great-grandson of the corrupt Colonel Walter, had become an unexpected ally in completing the restitution program. Working with international Holocaust organizations, they had successfully returned over 90% of Walter's preserved materials to verified survivors or appropriate memorial institutions. The wedding ring Emily had held that first evening in her grandparents' living room had been returned to Sarah Cohen in Toronto, whose grandmother Rebecca had worn it during her wedding in Vienna in 1938. The photograph of Sarah's grandmother opening the small package, her hands trembling as she recognized her family's lost treasure, had made headlines in newspapers around the world. "I never thought I would touch something my grandmother had touched," Sarah had written in her thank you letter to Emily. "Your great-grandfather didn't just preserve a ring. He preserved a connection to love that the war tried to destroy." The financial aspects of their discovery had been resolved through the creation of the Walter Thompson Memorial Foundation, administered jointly by Emily's family and several international Holocaust organizations. The remaining gold that couldn't be connected to specific families had been converted into funding for educational programs and survivor assistance, ensuring that Walter's protection of stolen treasure would continue benefiting victims of persecution. For generations to come, Emily's parents had arrived from Detroit 3 weeks after the official investigation concluded, drawn by newspaper stories about their daughter's role in completing one of the most significant Holocaust restitution efforts. In recent history, the family crisis that had sent Emily to her grandparents' farm for the summer seemed almost trivial compared to the moral legacy she had helped fulfill. "We've been arguing about mortgage payments and custody schedules," her mother had said, sitting in Rose's kitchen and reading through Emily's detailed documentation of their discoveries. Meanwhile, our 8-year-old daughter was completing work that has international historical significance. The reconciliation hadn't been immediate or simple, but watching Emily's confident presentation to international investigators and Holocaust organizations had reminded her parents of what really mattered in their family relationships. They were still working through their differences, but now they were doing it together rather than in separate bedrooms and lawyers' offices. Rusty had been officially recognized as the Archaeologue of the Year by the American Historical Association, though Emily suspected he was more interested in the endless supply of treats that accompanied his celebrity status than in any formal recognition of his treasure-hunting abilities. He still insisted on daily walks through the forest, though now their expeditions focused on documenting the natural history of the property rather than searching for buried secrets. Frank had returned to active teaching, accepting a position at the State University's History Department where he could share the lessons learned from Walter's preservation efforts with new generations of students. His lectures on ethics and historical preservation were consistently oversubscribed, attracting students who wanted to understand how individual moral courage could influence historical outcomes. Rose had become something of a celebrity in her own right, invited to speak at historical societies and community organizations about the role of family stories in preserving important history. "Every family has secrets," she would tell her audiences. "The question is whether those secrets serve justice or prevent it." Emily herself had grown in ways that went far beyond the physical changes of a summer spent outdoors. The quiet, withdrawn child who had arrived at her grandparents' farm in June had been transformed into a confident young person who understood that individual actions could have profound historical significance. The purple journal had been replaced by a larger, more professional documentation system that Emily used to record her ongoing correspondence with Holocaust organizations around the world. Families continued to contact her about items that might match Walter's preserved materials, and she had become surprisingly skilled at helping coordinate verification and repatriation efforts. "Do you ever wish we had just kept the treasure?" Frank asked one evening as they sat on the porch swing, watching fireflies begin their nightly performance. Emily considered the question seriously, thinking about the $8 million that could have transformed their family's financial circumstances forever. Then she thought about Sarah Cohen's letter, about the photographs of survivors reuniting with family treasures, and about the educational programs that would continue Walter's work for decades to come. "No," she said firmly. "Walter didn't save that treasure for us to keep. He saved it for us to give back. That's what made him a hero." Rusty appeared at her side, as if summoned by the conversation, his golden coat catching the porch light as he settled into his favorite position beside the swing. Emily scratched behind his ears and smiled at the memory of their first walk together, when both of them had been searching for something they couldn't name. They had found much more than treasure in those Michigan woods. They had discovered that moral courage could transcend generations, that family legacies were built on choices rather than circumstances, and that sometimes the most important adventures were the ones that led not to keeping something valuable, but to giving it away. The forest still held its secrets, but now they were the kind of secrets that enriched rather than burdened those who discovered them. And Emily had learned that the best treasures were the ones you shared with the world, ensuring that their value would grow rather than diminish with time.